Hi, Christina.
Hello.
Thank you for coming. Uh, you're down over in Texas.
I am.
So you have to tell us about this, or Rebecca, you'll have to give us the brief intro. You're one of, I think, our newer speakers, so I'm going to be completely candid. I didn't have quite as much time to do my homework on you, and so I'd love to hear a little bit about your story before you jump in.
Absolutely. Actually, my story is part of it, and I was going to ask all of you to share a little piece of your stories as part of my presentation. So if that's okay. I will say, though, that this research is on the effect of civic ed on civic engagement, and I worked on it through my spring semester. I'm finishing up my Master's of Public Affairs at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, and so I did this as part of my fellowship, and it seems that it might tie in a little bit with this participatory budgeting conference, and so I'm really excited to share this with y'all. And actually, if you made me co-host, I can share my screen, and I promise I will tell you more about myself because it's very much a part of why I chose to do this research. So
yeah, I'm just going to put a pin in that. If my dev team, who's staying with us, and dev team, I am so thoughtful and thankful and happy at how, there's Danny hugging his cactus over there. Christina, we literally founded FirstRoot on the belief that participatory budgeting in schools gives us an opportunity to create a positive civic engagement experience. Harris, we're talking about, you're talking about the math of participation. Well, how do we even create that hunger as young as third grade, second grade? How do we show, not to put it out there too strongly, but how do we fight the absolutely toxic crap from Facebook? How do we create an environment? Yes, I'm being recorded, and Mark Zuckerberg will never fund our company. Oh, so sad. How do we create that environment? So we're really excited about what you're going to be saying. And with that, I'm handing it over to you. Sam, you're smiling. So is there something we need to know?
No, I'm looking forward to Christina presenting. Of course, we're colleagues at UT. But I just always love listening to you talk about this stuff, Luke. It puts a smile on my face when at 11 p.m. in Texas I can be having these sorts of conversations with people who are enthusiastic is all.
Yeah, and I do have to say this before you begin, Christina, because I lived in Texas for a few years. So I definitely appreciate that you are almost with, I know we'll be doing fine when you don't give me a y'all, but you give me a all y'all, and then I'll be, completely comfortable.
You know what? That might just happen because I have a question for all y'all. So yeah, let's jump into it. But right before I do, Sam, you mentioned it's 11 p.m. here. I seriously questioned whether I should come with my pajamas, but I knew better than that. All right. So when I have the screen up, is that all you see? Is just the slideshow?
Yeah,
Yes.
We're good.
Perfect. Okay. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me, by the way. I'm so excited to be here, and I want to, before we get into any of this material, I'm a former teacher, and it's really important to me that I get to know a little bit of my audience and that you feel connected to this material. So I'd like to start with this question for all y'all to answer. How did you learn to civically participate growing up and as a college student? And I'll go to that screen here. There's the question. as a college student, as an adult, whether this is volunteering out in your community, engaging in political campaigns, or maybe through advocacy around certain issues. All of that counts. And so I don't know if everybody is comfortable jumping in, but I'd love to hear from at least a couple of people. Maybe Sam, I'll put you on the spot. How did you learn to civically participate?
Yeah, sure. I think certainly the thing that resonates most with me in memory is in the family model, right? I think as Aristotle said, man is a political animal, and politics and society starts with the smallest level of sort of group agency, which is a family, right? And so we learn so much of our civic participation through our family. And I was very fortunate to have parents who asked my opinion on things, and that certainly was the basis for learning civic participation.
Thanks for sharing. So it happened for you at an early age.
Yeah, I would
say
so, yes.
Okay, cool. Did anybody else want to jump in who's on this call? Well, if not, that is okay. But I will tell you a little bit about how I became civically engaged. So my name is Christina Liu Puentes, and I am the daughter of two immigrant families from Colombia and from China that had no background in civics or politics. And so how did somebody like me get into a master's program of public affairs? Because that's not their background at all. Like so many, this was a journey through my educational and my lived experiences. And education also gave both sides of my family enough that of this opportunity to accumulate their resources, and they came to the US. And neither of my families had any monetary wealth in their home countries, but they had this latent wealth in their education, right? And so they made it here, and the success they attained was largely in part made possible because of their education. And when I was a kid, my parents enrolled me in a Catholic school in Corpus Christi, Texas, which gave me opportunities to volunteer and engage with my community. And even though they themselves did not model that civic engagement for me as a child, I had a lot of exposure to it. And then in college, I realized the injustice of schooling having disproportionate benefits across each state, district, even between schools that are in the same neighborhood. And I wanted to know more about how I could be a part of leveling that playing field through policy, through that work. And so given that I come from a family line of educators, I became a teacher out of college. And I further saw this injustice, and I made lots of connections to my own educational experiences as a teacher. And I saw that there are kids in some schools that have so much help, while others had almost none outside of school. So I taught for 5 years. I taught first grade in a middle class charter school. And then I taught 10th grade English in a low-income public school. And those are the two hardest jobs I've ever had. And then I returned to graduate school at the LBJ School of Public Affairs to get the skills that I need to attain that justice for marginalized communities that have the most to gain from a strong public education system. And I was drawn to grassroots advocacy because it combined my passion for policy change with being grounded by working within my community. And again, nobody taught me this directly. This was an interest that I gained through exposure to social inequities in my work and in my academic pursuits. And before long, it hit me that the work I was doing and the people I was getting to know in the policy, advocacy, and government circles, they existed in this space that's just walled off from the people that I wanted to serve. And not to mention, higher education is a very culturally white space. So immigrants, children of immigrants, low-income individuals, and families of color, they all deserve to be a part of this so-called democratic process where we can fight for change, like this change I want to see in America's public schools. By the way, did you know that research shows lower rates of voting from second-generation Americans than from their parents, from naturalized citizens? So again, I felt this nagging injustice about the privilege of where I was and how I got here. And how could I be involved with increasing civic engagement from historically marginalized voices and make them feel like their voice and action belong at the table? So I realized that I could find this harmony between my interest in public education and my interest in democracy at the intersection of civic education and civic engagement. And this is the space that allows educators and social scientists to find a long-term solution to low civic engagement levels that also happens to hit people early in their lives when it can have the greatest impact, when they're still children, right? So I'm going to go on to my next slide here. Thanks for bearing with me. All right, just a little bit of a background on my research. So I attempt to find the curriculum for democracy through a systematic review comparing civic engagement levels across the US with a close examination of the effect of state level civic standards for high school graduation. This was really the only way that I could really measure any kind of difference, because it's harder to discern the like basically the standards at lower levels when it doesn't involve graduation. It's just a little harder to sift through. So through this various curriculum, and even though it's been implemented nationally, there are limited systematic reviews, like extremely limited, that have measured this normative political participation resulting from them. And the results have been inconclusive at best. There's like one thing out of the US, like one thing out of the UK, and they don't really measure longitudinal political or civic engagement. All right, so I will here. This is a graph of many countries and the votes cast in their most recent national election. The blue dots are the percentage of voting age population, and the tan dots are percentage of registered voters. If you look at the US, whoops, there it is. Since the turn of the 20th century, this percentage of eligible voters who cast a ballot in the United States has seldom reached more than 60%, even for states with the highest turnout. Politicians are voted in by a minority of the electorate, and this has major implications in representation and the health of our democracy. All right, so we know that education is one of the strongest predictors of civic participation. Significant behavior disparities linked to income, race, and education persist in political participation as measured by membership in political parties and campaign donations, campaign volunteering, participation in protests, so forth, right? Contacting an elected official, I have all of them here, right? Okay. Even just like wearing a campaign button or putting a political bumper sticker on your car. There seems to be this highly unequally distributed, it's highly unequally distributed, I should say. And it's by educational attainment. And the disparities in education and ongoing civic engagement only widens that gap in the distribution of power in society and quality of life. A little background on civics, because I think that it's widely misunderstood, especially in that context of what it once was. Civic education was once designed to assimilate recent immigrants to the US and instill in them the benefits of American democracy and Northern European culture and values. Northern states retained civics in that form until the 1960s, when there was this new set of criticism that formed around civics. And though some still believe that introducing students from diverse backgrounds to a common culture of democratic ideals, there were these Afrocentrists and supporters of bilingual and bicultural education that called out this cultural imperialism of this assimilationist style of civic curriculum. And evangelicals and fundamentalists were eager to join in this opposition, but from the perspective of desiring more religiosity in public schools. And ultimately, that traditional civic mission of America's public schools became understood as a form of oppression. And so it died out in the 60s with the civil rights movement. Civics of today. Today, civics should create a lifelong civic engagement for a well-constructed citizenry, and this holds state power accountable. And teaching this skill takes many forms, including educating students about how to stay informed on current events, how to engage elected officials, and how to participate in political processes and elections. A second common purpose is to develop early habits around community volunteerism and activism. Schools encourage students to volunteer in their community, whether as a graduation requirement or as part of a school club or elective, for example. A third purpose has formed from the cloth of that Afrocentrist criticism of civic education from the 1960s. It should explore the intersection of race with issues of justice and the law to promote active citizenship. However, as education policy is highly localized, each state and even school districts within the states can vary in their standards and their curriculum. So, as I've said, Civics Curriculum, which includes class content and instructional methods, varies widely across schools. Active and innovative teaching methods such as these found in, so these are two different programs, the College, Career, and Civic Life Framework, known as C3, has been adopted by many states to develop learners who are more likely to gain political knowledge and consequently become active citizens. And then there's this other one, We the People. This is research conducted by Professor Diana Owen of Georgetown University. And this has shown that disparities in civic curriculum are linked to different types and levels of democratic citizenship in practice. So her 2015 study compared the political knowledge of students enrolling in a civics program, which is this one, the We the People, the Citizen and Constitution, to that of students who had taken standard American government classes in Indiana high schools. And the WTP program has seen more than 28 million students in this time and 75,000 teachers in every state in the country and the District of Columbia since 1987. So through randomized control trials, they found that students gained more knowledge of government, race, and politics when their teachers had undergone this professional development through We the People. They also found that civics education proved more effective when students took civics as an elective rather than as a required class, and that an open classroom is conducive to student civic learning. And I'll click here so you can see a couple of the things that they did in each of these programs. So on the C3 side, we have discussion of current events, service learning, news media literacy. There we go. And then on the We the People side, we have group projects, debates, student speeches, something they had in common, simulations of democratic process and procedures like congressional hearings. And the We the People program even took their students to national competitions and things like this. So they had all these opportunities. And the comparison group of students that were enrolled in these traditional courses, like the AP courses and stuff, and these post-tests, they found that students' political knowledge was definitely more improved when they took this elective course through We the People. And there were correlations between post-test knowledge and certain demographic features such as race and ethnicity. However, notice that these results of this research, which is one of the only things I could find on civic education and its outcomes, this is measured by a test rather than through longitudinal civic engagement, as I had set out to find. So there's definitely a need for, there's a lot of research in civic ed and what makes it good, and then measuring civic engagement, but not a lot of people are trying to make the connection between the two. All right, most states require some combination of US government, US history, economics, and civic education for high school graduation. Additionally, every state mentions current events in its standards or curriculum frameworks, and 39 states mention news media literacy. But still, 10 out of 50 states have no formal civic requirement, and 31 out of 50 only require a half year of US government or civics, one or the other. And only 9 states require a full year, like 2 semesters worth of either US government or civics. A 2018 Brown Center report found that the most common programs across states are in fact classroom instruction, big surprise there, and a discussion of current events and news media literacy. 42 states and Washington, D.C. require at least one course related to civics education, but the problem is that this number lumps in other related social studies courses rather than isolating just the civics courses. So it's kind of hard to sift through that data to see the true measure of the impact of civics. And this is something that I had made. I know it's not super viewable in its entirety on this PowerPoint, but I'm gonna do my best to like show you the whole thing. Here you can get a sense for how this data lines up and then kind of where it deviates. So I determined each state civic engagement by cross-checking their volunteer ranking, which you see here in like that light blue color. And this is from 2015. And then I looked at the voter turnout ranking from 2016 and then political engagement ranking from 2020. These are all numbers that I found online. And nobody has done anything like this in researching civics. And what you're going to see here is that there's really not a lot of consistency in these rankings. And there is some correlation with states that have like a lot of civics in their curriculum, but it's not anything that I can really say with certainty that there's an impact here. So for a state to be considered to have good civic education requirements, they must at least give some priority to both civics and US government. And whether a state had implemented the C3 framework that I had mentioned earlier, this was factored into their civic education requirement. However, like I had said just a moment ago, it's just not possible to attribute the higher rates of statewide civic engagement to civics in schools without there being any existing research on the causative effect of civics on participation. So here's Washington. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. So we have Washington, and then we have a comparison here of Vermont. So Washington has like this consistent, it's all above average, right? But Vermont is a little more all over the map. And so you have these states that have like Colorado, Maine, Washington, that consistently rank high on all forms of civic participation and have this robust civic education requirement, which you can see over on the right. Washington State ranks 16th in volunteerism, 9th in voter turnout, and 2nd in political engagement. And it requires 1 year of US government blended with US history, along with half a semester of state government and state history. Washington also offers civics electives, though those are not required courses. And then Washington also participates in the C3 framework in a limited capacity. Still, you have states like, here's Vermont, for example, or Alaska or Montana. They have minimal to no required civics, and yet they have better than average participation. I mean, you know, it's like, how does this happen, right? Like, how much connection really is there between civic ed and these outcomes that we're seeing in their engagement? What is the magic sauce here that maybe we're missing with civic ed? You see Vermont ranked 8th in volunteerism, 15th in voter turnout, and 19th in political engagement. And then you also have states that have state standards for civics, but then have average to below average engagement, such as, and I'll go to the next slide here. You got California, New York, North Carolina. And then you have some states such as Alabama, Rhode Island, and Texas. All right, these have below average volunteer and political participation, and they also lack requirements for either civics, US government, or both. And Texas ranks 40th in volunteerism with just 22.9% of their residents volunteering in the year 2015, 42nd in voter turnout, and 40th in political engagement at just 31.9% of their youth ages 16 to 29, being engaged. And the state only requires 1 semester of US government, no civics. I'm going to go back to the previous slide for just a sec, if I can pull that off. There we go. All right, where was I? Yes, so it's important that I point out that most states' volunteer rankings, voter turnout rankings, and political engagement rankings were not consistent with each other. I think that's pretty obvious. You have Utah, for example, which has a high school graduation requirement of 1 semester of US government, and they rank first in volunteerism and 6th in political engagement. But then they're 35th in voter turnout for the 2016 presidential election. So let me see if I can go back. Oh, that was on the other slide. Yeah, so there's Utah. So you can see that right here. All right. Okay, so the mixed results of civic engagement outcomes relative to the state's mandated civic curriculum also indicate that there are these unobservable factors. And that's kind of what I'm alluding to with like the magic sauce, right? Such as community traits that shape people's desire to engage with their government and their neighbors. And invariably, some attribution for civic engagement comes down to state and community culture. I know it maybe is a little bit of a bitter pill to swallow, like, oh wait, like how do you change culture, right? Like that's kind of a sticky issue, but that's actually something that like why I spoke to Diana Owen personally as part of my research, and she was like, yeah, that's honestly part of it, and that's really hard to measure. So beyond student results and standardized tests that measure civic and history knowledge, like the National Assessments of Educational Progress, known as the NAEP, research was limited in one-to-one long-term impact for students from schools that have civic curriculum. And therefore, I was unable to draw a conclusion about how civic education contributes to civic engagement. There needs to be future research that teases out the effects of civics curriculum from other social studies courses such as US history or government. And research should also examine the extended social and economic impact of civic education for individuals and society. Finally, research should investigate the generational outcomes of civic engagement, particularly for marginalized people and immigrants. Go back one. Educational inequities across schools breed civic inequities in participation and representation in government. And students in private schools or in wealthy public schools often receive this civic learning, whether from their schools or by being socialized by their parents and their communities. And this is a privilege not afforded to millions of students who lack access to these institutions and these circumstances. And so offering civic curriculum in every school, rich or poor, public or private, becomes a civil rights issue. We also know that through service learning, we can create the most efficacious kind of long-term civic engagement, but it's also the most challenging to implement. And again, the Brown Center report, this found that, quote, fewer states have incorporated participatory elements of learning or community engagement in their curriculum. And just over half of states mention simulations of democratic procedures, while 11 states include service learning. So even though it is the most valuable source of learning, it's the hardest to implement, and so it's the least implemented state by state. And even in, so I'll make another point here, even in states with voter suppression tactics, we can see that well-informed and motivated voters still make it to the polls. Like how? What makes it possible for people to vote even in states where the barriers are high, such as Texas, right? Predictably, the through line for social and civil rights inequities is wealth, which is closely linked to education. And income affects participation rates and has implications both on voter turnout and public policy. People with traditional work schedules, expendable time to research political issues and candidates, and the capacity to join political and social organizations are more likely to be tapped into a network of like-minded folks. So this opportunity cost of time that is afforded to those with higher wages, which often derives from higher educational attainment, allows people to become more interested in civic life and political influence. Although a curriculum for democracy cannot correct for every factor, influencing what and how to teach civics, US history, and government in schools is one step toward leveling the playing field. Now, as we move into my final section about policy recommendations, I'm going to bring my perspective back into this just a little bit. my time in grad school has opened my eyes to this whole of the policy world and how education policy is only a piece of the puzzle to reach a more equitable society. And there are many other issues that must be addressed head on for people to have better schools or higher civic ed, right? And civic participation as well. People have to have economic stability, housing stability, food security, healthcare, and so much more before they're ready to learn in a classroom or before they're ready to help others. And it's that old analogy of putting on the oxygen mask before helping others when your plane's going down, right? And so advancing civic education has actually just not been a priority for almost 60 years, though we do see under the Biden administration, the Department of Education has proposed 2 priorities for American history and civics ed programs to improve the quality of American history, civics, and government, and information literacy skills as well, and to improve the quality of teaching of these subjects in elementary and secondary schools. I love that elementary piece because there's so much focus on this at the high school level when I really think that it could start in elementary school. You can never start too early. Progressive beyond the American tradition of civics, this proposal seeks to inject critical race theory, the controversial critical race theory, into the program, specifically naming the 1619 Project and Ibram X. Kendi's text on anti-racism. You know, teaching civics could become culturally and linguistically responsive. Learning would become centered around the students' lived experiences and reflect their diversity, identities, and their histories. And the rhymes of history sing true. In its new proposed form, civic education already faces controversy and once again confronts intense opposition. The time, I think, is overdue for us to invest resources into civic learning so that we may build this culture of civics. And that is the building block of our democracy. I believe that it is undemocratic that civic engagement is so varied by geography. So first, we must fund civic education research, measure the longitudinal impact of civics on the health of American democracy and civic participation, and then use that research to figure out what form of civic curriculum will increase participation within that particular area for the state, the city, and the neighborhood. Second, we're going to go to 3. Second, implement evidence-based replicable civic curriculum. And that is proven to boost civic engagement in low-income communities and for people of color. Tailor curriculum to different populations depending on their lived experiences. This means that while scalability is important, I know we all love that word, it's not a strategy that will work universally in a cookie-cutter form. Further, encourage marginalized students to lead student bodies and join leadership development programs and start early. Again, civics in elementary school. Third, train all teachers in culturally responsive teaching and train social studies teacher in culturally responsive civics instruction. Teach students about the history of their heritage in the United States and teach about the country's history of civic engagement with experiential opportunities for students. Fourth, remove barriers for low-income students to become civically engaged. I think this one is huge. And I think that that's part of the work that y'all are doing with participatory budgeting, which I think is just so fascinating. I mean, for instance, you pay students to participate rather than expecting them to volunteer their time. Assist them through the process of getting their state IDs, for example. That's a resource barrier so that they can get a job. Because you can't get a job without your ID. You can't vote without your ID in Texas and several other states. And it's just more and more with time. Sponsor volunteer opportunities on the school campus to reduce transportation barriers for volunteers, for example. And finally, create a voter registration system in schools. Not just that though, invite parents, family, and community members to the school so that they can learn alongside their student about voting registration and the voting process, because in that process, you will rope in a lot of non-voters and turn them into first-time voters because they're just intimidated by the process. And so you create this community around voter education. All right, thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I will take questions now.
Sam, I'm gonna let
Awesome.
you go first because you know I'm gonna jump in with a whole bunch.
Yeah, I've got like 3 or 7 things, but I'll start with 1 or 2 perhaps. You know, the couple of bits that really stuck out to me were, you know, you talked about the prioritization issue that we have, right? It's the opportunity cost, limited, you know, scarce resources, right? So at a public policy level, it's both a traditional economic question, and that in the private investment world, the prioritization is mostly driven by profit, right? So those are the 2 sort of systems that we use to drive prioritization. And I think the point that you made was fantastic. That I mean, what I got from it is that it's almost a chicken and egg situation, because whilst we need to solve for things like food security and economic inequality, you know, and healthcare issues and climate change and environmental issues, part of the solution in the first, you know, and we say that we need to solve for those before we have a system where we can go in and encourage people to participate in civics. Part of the solution, I think, to those problems is civic engagement, right? And when you provide a positive, collaborative, and cooperative experience at a formative age, and we can call it something sort of different to civics so we don't confuse it exclusively with things like voting behavior. But when we create this mindset of collaboration and cooperation, which I say is the basis for a democracy, we have people moving into you know, their independency and their adulthood, better equipped to then turn to the solution of these greater problems in collaborative and cooperative ways. And so with this, you know, with this secular chicken and egg situation, I think it's really important that we recognize that you need to be dealing with civics so you can deal with all of those other problems. So that's sort of the first thing that I wanted to say. That was more of a statement than a question.
Yeah, it was more of a statement.
It was more of a statement than a question.
You're absolutely
so I have a question,
right, though.
but I have a question for you to follow up on my statement. You know, it was interesting hearing you talk about scale and designing things that are localized in the sense that they accommodate the particular nature and the idiosyncrasies of each student body and each relationship between, you know, an educator and the students and the schools and that sort of things. But I think that it's possible to design stuff that operates at scale when it's not, you know, linear top-down curriculum driven. And I think that that's what participatory budgeting is, because the design of what you're providing is about supporting and facilitating a conversation so that the voice and the expression given by the students in the process, which, you know, obviously matches the curriculum, is the particular of that situation. And that's not to suggest that we shouldn't go in and get, you know, we don't need to go in and make sure that we're cognizant of these differences. But I think the wonderful thing about PB with civics is that you're actually directly addressing the particulars and the local nature of all of these student bodies.
Right.
So I'm wondering whether, yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
My question is, do you think that is an adequate logic, or do you think that more is required on top? And if so, what can, you know, when we work with schools with PB, and, you know, with the lens on civics, how do we make sure that we're both designing for scale so that we can get into as many schools as possible, whilst also being cognizant of these particular things?
Right. I think that is the crux, isn't it? I think that you also answered your question, Sam. I mean, it's absolutely, the problem solves itself in the work that y'all are doing. And I think that is brilliant, because it's, you can't do what I understand is your proposed, you know, program without getting involved in the community. And I think that's just a huge part of it. Like with civics, you want students to have this participatory learning which means that it cannot just take place in the classroom. It can't just be a textbook. It can't be just classroom instruction, or even just looking at national news and working on that news literacy. It's not enough, right? Like, you have to get the kids out of the classroom. And as soon as you get them out of the classroom, they're in the community. And that personalizes it. Those are people that they know, you know, these are streets that they know, these are buildings that they know, these are people that they know. I mean, it's just that becomes that tailored curriculum, I guess. And you have to trust the teachers. You have to trust that the teachers know how to tailor their curriculum for the students that they have in their classroom that year. And I think that from, you know, just speaking from experience as a former teacher, there's a hesitancy to let go of the control and just give that in the hands of the teachers. I don't know if it's an issue of trust or what, or if it's just, you know, a matter of power and control, but there's something there where a lot of folks just don't trust teachers to do what they're going to do, which is to know their students and modify their curriculum accordingly. You know.
So one of the things that I wanted to highlight, because we've read quite thoroughly and reread quite thoroughly, is the Brown report you referenced. And one of the questions I have for your research is, did you have a chance to crack into, and it would be fine to me if you said no, because I think the task would be enormous, but did you have a chance to crack into the details of a given curriculum? Because one of the things that Brown talks about, and we're modeling in the work that we do, is the notion of the difference between a technical skill, say like calculus is knowledge, versus a core life skill. And we equate financial literacy and civics in the same structure of having knowledge, skill, and disposition. And I was wondering if some of the differences in the civic engagement data would be, if you actually looked at the details of a given curriculum, if you would find that students who had lived in states and gone through education in states that had a greater emphasis on skill and disposition were more civically engaged, because I think that without actually having a little bit more insight, it's going to be hard to say this curriculum is better or worse if it doesn't have the right kind of weighting and balance. But I don't know if your research got that into that level of detail.
You know, Luke, I tried.
Yeah.
But
okay.
I will say I have limitations.
Yeah.
I did this in addition to having 4 classes as a graduate student, which is just, I don't know why the LBJ school does that. It's crazy. And also having a part-time job.
Yeah,
but
no,
you know
it's
what?
nuts.
I tried. I did
Yeah.
try. And I looked at, I mean, I can't tell you how many hours I poured into looking at the state mandated standards in various states.
Yeah, they're all over the map. Yeah.
for social studies at various levels, but definitely mostly I found it at the government and US history kind of realm. But that's an interesting point you make, because I think that kind of hints at culture there. Like, what I'm saying is, like, this is like a really hard thing to shift, and disposition or whatever, right, towards having this interest, I think is largely cultural. And it's like, how do you teach that? And so I actually would love to get back to you on that. I could go back and dig up my old notes on the various standards and kind of compare them like with that lens, but I hadn't quite looked at it like that yet.
Yeah, I expect an email from us, because as we start to develop our civics curriculum, right, we're looking at some of those aspects. The other element is the I'd say the probably 2 more generations of recalibrating and reconstructing lived experience in the tragically and historically racist structures associated with voting, right? There's just this enormous overhang that manifests in all sorts of absolutely weird ways. The easy one is the gerrymandering. I mean, everyone talks about that, but like, that's the easy low-hanging fruit.
Right.
The other stuff that you're talking about is really important. So if you were the queen and you had in your scepter's power the ability to tell FirstRoot, these 3 things must be covered in a civics curriculum to create. And I tell people, I actually don't care if you're Democrat or Republican or Libertarian or Tea Party. I'm very much in the Greek ideal of engagement and the loss of the structure of our world. One of the slides that Sam has seen me show quite a bit is there's a report on the deconsolidation of democracy, which shows that democratic engagement isn't declining in the US, it's declining in every generation. So, I mean, every Western democracy, if you pick the Western democracy, it's declining everywhere. And one hypothesis is that because democracy is a certain kind of freedom, and freedom requires a certain kind of struggle, the question becomes, can you have a democratic society sustain itself without war or revolution? So given the kind of negative outcomes that are associated with both war and revolution, my question to you is this: if you had 3 things that you could construct in a curriculum where you were the queen, what would be those 3 things? And I'm going to take away a principle, because we've got curriculum development principles that talk about project-based learning, student-generated outcomes. We talk about,
oh, you're making it harder, Luke.
Yeah, we talk about you can't have any of the 4 C's of the 21st century curriculum. You can't have any of the 5 C's of positive youth development. I'm looking for very concrete things like, I'll give you one that you said, and I'm testing you how strongly you believe in it. Like, there should be a class on what IDs you need to participate in a civil society and why you should get them. You should get, your passport. You should get your driver's license. You should get your voting registration and done. So that could be one. Like, you need a lesson on that. And you can't even have that one because I gave it to you. So now you need 3.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
Well,
sorry.
What about the C of critical race theory? Does that count?
I'm down with critical race theory. I'm almost done with Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Alone in the Cafeteria by Tatum. And so I can be aligned with critical race theory as a lesson. So you can say one lesson would be critical race theory, because we're learning that the development of self-identity and social identity with respect to a given race is part of the maturation process, no matter what race you identify with. So I can go with critical race theory as being one of them. You got that one.
Well, I also mentioned, I think that there needs to be, I don't know if this is so much a curriculum, but it's not a principle either. It's just that resource barriers are so high for some folks, and it doesn't seem like much to us, right? Because we're in a privileged space. But to somebody else who maybe has like $100 ticket, I mean, that is debilitating, right? Like, or the cost of getting their ID. And so maybe we could tweak that a little bit and say, like, let's educate folks on how to handle those resource barriers better. And so that they're no longer the giant barriers that they are currently for some folks.
And what's interesting about that, that's number 2. I like that. And what's really interesting about that is through our curriculum, it would be entirely acceptable if the students in a school created a proposal to fund the cost of any resource barrier for the other students. And we've seen students in PB do this. In San Jose, California, students at Overton High School voted to fund driving lessons for the poor income of the poor students who couldn't even afford the driving lessons.
That's amazing.
Yeah, well, they, give people a chance, and guess what happens? They can rise up. Okay.
Right.
That's 2. I like the resource barrier one, because it also gives people agency when they become adults to change the resource barrier, because now they're aware of it. So I'm down with that. Okay, I need one more because I'm being selfish.
Oh my goodness.
Well, welcome to the world of Luke, Christina.
You know, I think that the last one, maybe I'm cheating, is that students have to learn through experience. And so we could plug that more into curriculum, like how, well, the experience, for example, of arguing in Congress. Let's have a mock trial, right? Like there's actually one of the teachers of the year, or somebody who, he was teacher of the year in Austin Independent School District a couple of years ago. And then he won another award for a grant to fund this project that he has in his high school here. And he has a courtroom built out of his high school. And it's phenomenal. He actually gets attorneys to come in pro bono. They work with the students, and the students basically become like paralegals, and they're doing real work in their community and helping people with like actual cases, of course with the assistance of real attorneys, but they're doing the work. So it's along the lines of this participatory budgeting that y'all have envisioned. It's that the students are doing the work themselves, and they're being given this huge responsibility, but with a lot of support. Like they have all the structures to support them through it. But I think that things like that, a kid's never going to forget how they helped their, I think there was one story about like how they helped the janitor
Sure.
with some legal issues, like small things, but like they're never going to forget that. And they're going to want to continue to be engaged in their community with that experience, right? At such a formative age.
No, I love that. That's fantastic. I'm not convinced we'll be going after something like a mock trial, but I love this, experience-based learning, project-based learning, student-generated outcomes. Like that is speaking our language. The only other one, and I'm going to rope this back into Harris's talk about voting, is.
And I unfortunately only caught like the last 10 minutes of it. So
yeah, which is really pretty cool though. But as part of Harris's talk, there's different voting systems and there's different voting algorithms. And Harris, we are geeks with you, my friend. And so we are completely in my dream log, which is kind of cooler than a backlog because it's where all your dreams go. In the dream log, we have discussions about things like giving students in the planning phase of participatory budgeting, when they're planning their process, to let them choose a given voting algorithm after a debate of voting algorithms, and then use that voting algorithm for that PB cycle. And the reason I bring this up, which is kind of controversial to some of my friends in the PB community, is without the opportunity to experiment and experience, you can steal this phrase, anyone, if you want to steal it. I always say, you can't read a bike. You can ride a bike and then you know what balance feels like. And you also know what wind in the hair feels like, and skin knees when you got too fast and you don't. So you can't read a bike. You can ride a bike. And so one of the things that I dislike about these discussions when we get to students is this notion of a scarcity mindset. You got to get it right because we're doing it this. No, we actually want to do participatory budgeting in 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, in the dance club, in the band. So if you gave them more opportunities for experiencing participatory budgeting, the act of frequency it creates itself opportunities for, Harris, how was this voting algorithm? How was stacked rank algorithm? How was this? Let's put this in place. Let's look at the source code, right? Let's understand how the actual algorithm that you identified, got expressed in actual Java or Ruby or Perl or whatever that is. So Christina, the reason I'm bringing it up is because I think that's the only other thing that I'd like to understand is how many touches, and I know that, again, this was outside of the scope and impossible to get, but I think that, if you think of civic engagement as playing a certain kind of game with a certain kind of rules, then the first time you play a game, you're not playing the game, you're learning how to play the game. The first time you play Monopoly, you're not playing Monopoly, you're learning Monopoly. You're not, the first time you play Euchre or Settlers of Catan, you're not actually playing the game. And so part of the goal is, can we give more gameplay experiences so students can go, oh, this is how political persuasion works. Got it. This is how I convince people to vote for my proposal.
Right.
Oh,
Definitely. I mean, I think that you're definitely on the right track with thinking that it has to happen more than once. And I think that's a big mistake in education curriculum right now, is that we think we can just go over this a single time and that kids will get it. And that's just false. I think that something like PB or Civics should start absolutely at the elementary level. I know that there is some research on repetition though, because at a certain point it doesn't really increase the, the productivity there, the learning. So it has to be done right. And one thing that I actually, kind of a separate project, but related to my civics research, I was thinking about, like, how can we get more people registered to vote in Texas? And that's my idea about getting these voter registration drives in schools. And it's more than just getting like the high school seniors registered, it's bringing everybody else in. Okay, so there's that. But I was thinking that's not enough either. So we have to start talking about voting and like the ballot box and all of these things much sooner. And I don't see anything wrong with starting to talk to kids about that with every single election cycle.
sure. Absolutely.
And so using those, again, grounded in real life opportunity, using those experiences repeatedly, I think is more productive than just, all right, we're doing the unit on civics now because we do it every year. I mean, it has to be tied to something. So I think that that's exactly, again, what y'all are doing. And so I think that you knew the answer to your question, sir.
Well, no, a little bit I did, but it's more of just, and I didn't mean it overly leading the witness. It's just that I do think that it was more of a statement along the lines of Sam. Like there's a certain positional structure that we're taking at FirstRoot, and one of these positional structures, it's not some like kind of like, oh, you've got to do this so that you buy a lot of our product. Big deal. It's that if you want to create the opportunity, and it's also the maturation of the human brain and the ability for, a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old and a 15-year-old, there are notable differences in cognitive development and the ability to reason critically. Right. And without repeated opportunities to practice that, then we're left without really developing a skill. So.
Well, and the opportunity builds over time, right? Yeah. Maybe when you're 7 years old, you're walking to the ballot box with your parent and you just watch the process. Just that exposure alone is huge because it tells them this is not a super intimidating process. I'm here right now and I'm 7 years old. I mean, and then of course, as time goes on, you explain more and more about the process. And so I think there's absolutely room to make it cognitively appropriate, for students of any age, and it builds with each exposure. I think that I think y'all know that, but you can apply it to literally any tool, any skill, any area of knowledge, I think.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Super exciting stuff. I mean, this is great. Okay, we got lots of claps going on in Zoom.
Oh, thanks, y'all.